Hello, my name is Peter Kingstone. I'm the Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Montclair State University. I'm so sorry that we can't greet you in person on our beautiful campus, but I'm glad that modern technology has given us this opportunity to connect with you virtually. So today we'd like to talk a little bit about some of the really important issues in American society and give you a sense of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and the way that we connect to it. We are an intellectual powerhouse of research and innovative teaching around all sorts of questions of social justice, racism, inequality, how to produce genuinely progressive reform to create a truly democratic, inclusive, plural society. And today, we're going to take the opportunity to focus on this momentous election. We're at the doorstep of one of the most consequential elections in American history, a time when we are bitterly divided, polarized, tremendous unrest, and one of the critical issues driving us today are questions about police reform and criminal justice reform and racism in American society. So to give you a little taste of the extraordinary quality of the people that we've got in the college doing research and teaching, I am delighted to welcome today two of our stars from the Department of Justice Studies, Professor Jessica Henry, who's got a brand new book that you should go out and get if you're interested in questions of criminal justice. It's called Smoke But No Fire. I'm just going to make sure I remember the subtitle. When innocent people are wrongly convicted of crimes that never happened. It just came out. And along with her is her colleague, Assistant Professor Jason Williams, who is an expert on criminal justice and policing in the United States, and who has a recent co-edited book called Black Males and the Criminal Justice System. On that note, I'm going to turn to our two experts here and ask them, if people care about criminal justice reform and police reform in the United States today and care about this election, what are the things that we should be thinking about or that we need to understand?
Jason, you want to go first, or?
Great. Yes, so I think one of the major points that Jessica and I wanted to talk upon, or at least unpack for this session, is the current election. So paying very, very close attention to some of the policy initiatives that are coming out of the two camps, if you will. So with regards, I know, to police reform in particular, there have been some calls in the camps. So for instance, the elimination of sort of this notion of the criminalization of poverty. And so what does this mean? And I know Jessica will delve a little bit into this as well in talking about the courts, but the elimination of cash bail, which in many ways sits as a modern day, debtor's prison system, if you will. But how cash bail in many ways sort of contributes to a lot of the negative interactions between marginalized communities and police. Oftentimes it is police who have to go out and, find where these individuals are who have either junk bail or who have warrants out for their arrest and so forth. But also how the bail system serves as a very discursive system of social control that disproportionately impacts marginalized and impoverished individuals as well. So sort of seeing policing as something more than even just the traditional officer with a badge. But more than that as well, thinking about how we can take funding from law enforcement budgets and put them in community-based programs. So not necessarily getting rid of police agencies or defunding them wholesalely, but again, reinforcing values and systems within the community such that the community can take care of itself and be more healthy.
Yeah, and I think, so cash bail is absolutely one of those big issues that reflects the intersection of poverty and criminal justice. And listen, for all of you who are New Jersey folks, New Jersey is one of the leaders in the nation on this issue. And we have eliminated cash bail for a lot of low-level offenses, and we haven't seen any corresponding increase in crime. So it's a policy that promotes public safety while still protecting the most marginalized and vulnerable people in the community, which are folks who are being held in jails pre-trial, waiting for their cases to get resolved, for minimal amounts of bail, $50, $250. And so, and these kinds of issues are on the ballot, right? Because who you elect ultimately sets the policy. Now, in New Jersey, I'm going to flip over to the courts for a second, as Jason referenced, but in New Jersey, we have appointed prosecutors. So we are not involved in this nitty-gritty local election for prosecutors and for judges and for sheriffs. They're all appointed here. But in other parts of the country, DA races are changing criminal justice at the local level. So if we want to talk about big policies, we can certainly go there, but at the local level, who your prosecutor is matters. And I'll give you a couple of examples, and then Jason can sort of piggyback right off of that. So, you know, there are prosecutors, progressive prosecutors, who when you hear them talk, you're like, you're a prosecutor, but they're saying things like, we're going to decline, or we are declining to prosecute marijuana cases. Now, that's a big issue in New Jersey, right? That's the #1 question on the ballot. For those of you that have yet to vote, you can take a look at that question on the ballot. But that's a prosecutor's decision. Prosecutors have tremendous power. They decide whether to prosecute somebody, for what crimes to prosecute somebody, for how much bail they want to ask for. And so when you've got a progressive prosecutor who's elected, it can change the course of criminal prosecutions and jail sizes in any particular county. And so there's some really exciting races. Like, I'll give you an example. In Ohio, there is a county where the existing prosecutor literally loves the death penalty. He is one of the biggest drivers of the death penalty in Ohio and ultimately in the country, this one county in Ohio. And his opponent is saying, I would abolish capital punishment. I would support any abolition efforts, and I'm not going to be seeking capital punishment. That's a huge and stark difference for the voters in Ohio to decide who they want and what kind of criminal justice policy they want. So I think prosecutor races nationally are really exciting to watch, and they're a big bellwether of support for criminal justice reform.
Can I ask you folks a question? I'm listening to this, and I'm just fascinated, and I'm a political scientist by training. I'm not a justice person, a sociologist, or a criminal law. And as I'm listening to it, I think about the American context. And what is really on the radar is the issue of police and police violence. And that is what is making one segment of the population really angry to the point that they're going out and risking COVID and protesting, and is triggering a reaction on the part of President Trump and supporters of President Trump of, law and order. And then, you look at polls and you see, okay, there's this support for the notion of defunding the police, although a lot of people don't really know what that means, but it's very focused on that question of do we support the police, do we not support the police? And then you're identifying something that is really, really meaningful about the nature of policing and the criminal justice system, focused on bail and whether or not marginal people have enough money to stay out of prison when they're arrested. We never hear about those things. And you're both telling us that, in fact, there seems to be this momentum for change. And I was wondering, could you maybe, because we're so focused on the media, on the really big issue, I don't think we hear about this impetus for change on this really important lower level issue. So I was wondering, could you maybe share a little, if you know, I mean, again, I apologize, I'm a political scientist, I think this way. Where do you think the energy for reform is coming from? Who's pushing it? Who's supporting it? Is that something that you feel you can address?
Yeah. So in some activist circles on the ground within communities, you do have pockets of folk who have been addressing, the sort of larger scope of things that needs to change. I know on Black Lives Matter website, Campaign Zero website, and some other, activist groups who are probably not as known as those, they have been addressing some of these issues. I sort of see them as these sort of larger interlocking oppressions, right, or repressions that individuals face as they cycle through the system. I think the only reason why we know more about policing is because it is most salient, most visible. It is the first institution or bracket within the administration of justice that citizens interact with, right? So you're doing something out on the street, or maybe not, but then you come in contact with police officers, and then all of a sudden now you're introduced to the prosecution, right? Now you're brought into the court system. And then after which, then you go into corrections, and then after that, perhaps community corrections. And so it is a much more grander system than just policing. And in each of these levels, right, many activists will exclaim there needs to be reform. Because again, with that brings all kinds of interlocking oppressions. And it definitely does matter if whether or not you are Black, right, white, Hispanic, Asian, but then also your gender, your sexual identity, and things of that sort. And, you know, in some of the political campaigns of late, there have been some promises made, right? Whereby, you know, people have said that they will change conditions in prisons. For instance, when you look at a lot of the women's prisons were not designed really to be, you know, accommodated to women. Right? Women prisons were designed to pretty much mimic that of the male prisons. We also know that by and large, they are denied basic necessities. This is a problem. So when we think about, again, those interlocking oppressions that defendants are likely to face as they cycle through the system, we need to think alongside gender context as well. So that's one such example.
Yeah, and I think from the legal perspective, for those of us who've been thinking about criminal justice for a really long time, I don't think you can have any conversation at all about criminal justice if you don't talk about race, and you don't talk about poverty. Because there are very few people, there are some, but there are very few people in the criminal justice system who have money. And they're, you know, and when we see sort of particular policing policies or even, you know, legislatively set policies, they often target the poorest of communities, which in this country often intersect with communities of color. And so but for almost everybody on both sides of the aisle, we have come to recognize that our system of mass incarceration, 2.3 million bodies, right, are incarcerated today. That makes us not only the world's leading jailer, right? We are the world's leading jailer in terms of absolute numbers, but also on a per capita basis. And it's cost us so much financially. So even people who aren't particularly progressive are sort of saying, like, do we really need to be spending this much money keeping this many people behind bars, and can we do it differently? And so that's also an interesting moment in our history. We're broke, right? I mean, as a nation, we are so in debt, and there are literally counties whose budget is so excessively focused on corrections and on prosecuting people and on convicting people, that percentage of their budget is so high that they've actually had to neglect other infrastructure projects and other things like schooling and public service. So there is a national recognition that we've gone completely off the rails in terms of how many people are pulled into the system. And I think that's also animating some of the conversation. And then, you know, with the George Floyd shooting, it's just sort of captured on video what we know, which is that we have come to rely too heavily on the police to resolve social problems. And where do we get additional funding, attention, resources to address some of the root causes of criminality in the first place? How do we respond better to mental health issues? And all of this, going back to the election, is going to very much be reflected on who we put into office.
Yes, and some of those promises have been made in this election, so about addressing those concerns.
Yeah, it matters. I mean, it really, this is a highly important, highly charged, highly important referendum, if you will, on how we want to move forward in the lens of criminal justice, how we want to move forward as a nation. We don't have to keep doing what we're doing. And things like New Jersey's marijuana initiative would, you know, in New Jersey, I don't know if you know this, I'm sure Jason knows this, but I don't know if everyone listening knows this, but marijuana arrests of black people are 3 times more than white people. That's not because blacks use marijuana more than whites. I mean, we're talking about a racially disparate policing program. If we legalize marijuana, it's not just about an economic boon potentially for the state. It's also a social justice statement about who we want to police and how we want to police and what we want to prioritize.
That's terrific. Thank you.
And another area of concern too would be, and particularly in New Jersey, I know we have like these grave disparities even in the administration of juvenile justice. And so we cannot forget, right, the areas of reform that are needed in how we are, again, trying and convicting and detaining our juveniles. Again, grave racial disparities in juvenile justice in our state. And I'm part of a team at, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice and a bunch of other people who are part of a larger coalition in trying to address this matter and trying to, again, sort of get the state to close some of these detention facilities and allow the communities to better address, those juveniles who might transgress against the community.
So, there's a lot to unpack when it comes to issues of criminal justice reform on the agenda. So we talked a little bit about bail reform. We talked a little bit about prosecutors. We talked a little bit about social movements. We talked a little bit about marijuana. We talked a little bit about policing. Jason, where else should we go? There's so many places we can.
Yes, I think going back to corrections, I think it's important to talk a little bit about reentry. Okay, so what happens to individuals once they pay their dues, as we say, and then they cycle back home? Well, it's important that we understand that due to certain policies that are on the book, and then also, some informal policies, right? So just ways in which we tend to just treat people, period, once they are released. These individuals are just they're seriously hindered from being able to reintegrate society, as a result of having been labeled felon or what have you. And this too needs to change, and it disproportionately affects those who are impoverished, and that can be anyone from any racial ethnic background, but definitely disproportionately folk of color, definitely.
And so reentry, right? The idea that folks who are incarcerated come back into the community, that's a huge issue. And finding employment, finding housing, being barred from certain kinds of career choices, even barbers. You can't get a license to be a barber in some states if you have a felony conviction. But in terms of the election, 5.2 million people are disenfranchised because of a conviction. And so if you back into what we've been talking about this whole time, we have a system of mass incarceration. Right? When I said 2.3 million, I'm talking about today. That doesn't include all the folks who were convicted and are now out in society again. And yet they're living under these Byzantine structures that, for instance, keep them out of the voting box.
That's right.
That's a huge problem. Right. And, in places like Florida, in 2018, the voters said, this is crazy. We are disenfranchising all of these people of color because they've got convictions, they've served their time. Let's reinstate them. And they did pass a constitutional amendment allowing them to do so. But then the Florida legislature and the Republican governor signed a bill that said, okay, yeah, you can vote, but only once you pay your fines and fees. Well, some of the fines and fees are so onerous that people who are poor can't pay them. And remember, if you've got a felony conviction, you often can't find work. So you are stigmatized, you're broke, and so you can't pay the fines and fees. So even though now you've been constitutionally authorized by your fellow citizens to vote, you can't. And that has a huge impact. Florida, if you remember, in Bush and Gore, that election was lost by a margin that was almost equivalent to the folks that have been disenfranchised.
That's right.
So
that's right.
The issue of felony disenfranchisement is also a huge part of reentry and how we treat people who have been convicted. It's all related to each other. There isn't any one moment in the system that we can say, okay, if we just fix this, everything will be better.
Yeah. And it's important that we contextualize these types of tactics, unfortunately, within historical context, of course. It wasn't until the 60s that African Americans in particular were fully brought into the franchise. And so if we allow history to repeat itself through processes of justice, then, that is a scab that we are pulling back that I think we ought not do. Right. And so history should always be our foremost guide on some of these practices. Now, I think luckily for New Jersey, however, we have done the right thing with regards to those under some type of community supervision. If you recall earlier this year in March, our governor indeed had signed a bill that would allow about over 80,000 people, believe it or not, to vote, who were either under probation or parole. So that was a tremendous victory in our state, which allowed people to be able to go out and vote, who were under, and for some of them, the very first time, right, that they had actually gone to the polls. So that was a tremendous victory. If we could have more of that around the country, I think you would be that much more closer to a democracy.
Yeah.
If I can maybe ask a question, take us to the national level. Well, I mean, I think it's fairly clear that in President Trump and the Republicans and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the Democrats, we are looking at extremely different understandings of the nature of the problems and the solutions. I'm curious, though, about two things. Jessica recently wrote a blog about the importance of voting that I thought was just wonderful, and I wanted to ask a question that invokes that blog. I know a lot of progressive voices, especially young progressive voices. My own children are in their 20s and feel this way. Feel that both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris represent weaker options on questions of social reform and social justice around policing, criminal justice. I was wondering if both you could share your thoughts on whether or not Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have a strong positions on these questions, and secondly, I mean, if you could help us, a lot of the things you're talking about are local innovations, local reforms. How much does it matter at the national level if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris win and are able to implement their agenda?
So, it is an interesting question, right? Because most of criminal justice is reserved to the states, right? I mean, that's how our Constitution set it up. So the federal government has specific powers, enumerated powers, and then the states have sort of all the rest of it. And so when we do talk about criminal justice reform, a lot of that does occur at the state and local level. However, our national leaders have tremendous influence both in the federal criminal justice system, right? There's a whole separate system for folks who commit federal crimes, and also in terms of helping set agendas through funding for research, through withholding funding if you don't adhere to certain visions and policies. And so that does really matter. And if you look at the criminal justice platforms that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris set out, they have a lot of great ideas. Now, listen, they both have questionable moments in their political histories where they maybe were not as progressive champions of criminal justice, but they both seem to have come to realize. So, for instance, Joe Biden was a proponent of the 1994 Crime Act. That has had tremendously negative consequences on mass incarceration. But he's also said, you know what? We need to do that differently now. And he has talked about decriminalizing marijuana, and he has talked about reducing prison populations. They've talked about getting rid of the federal death penalty. Their proposals are real, and they will make change on the ground in significant ways that matter.
Yeah. And also, I know within their campaign, excuse me, they mentioned how they would seek to actually expand the use of the U.S. Department of Justice in addressing, systemic misconduct in police departments and believe it or not, prosecutors' offices, which is something that we don't typically hear about. And I know Jessica, talked about this a bit earlier, as well as in many of her blog posts. But this is something that we haven't seen under the current administration, and this will have both national and local impact because they are addressing constitutional issues in many of those respects. Now, with regards to how the federal government can help impact local level as well, as like Jessica said, through the delegation of federal funds. So I know that in this campaign as well, there was this sort of call to expand funding with regards to mental health and substance abuse, but also to give funding to those who can come up with more progressive programming around, lessening their, incarcerated population and such. And we've seen this through the disproportionate minority confinement initiative as well, going back a few decades, which basically said, listen, if you want money for juvenile justice, as a state, you're going to have to find a way to lessen your racial disparities in your youth, detention facilities. So these are ways in which the federal government can certainly influence the local level. Now, the question here is, of course, is whether or not the local government is doing so, if they're complying because they really want to, or because they just want the money, right? I guess we'll never really know, but these are definitely great ways in which the federal government can make an influence. But because of the way in which, as Jessica mentioned, the Constitution sets up our government, it's very, very hard for the federal government to just simply come into New Jersey and say, okay, you got to do this, that, and the third.
Although, and this is what I was I didn't mean to interrupt you before, Jason, but this is what I was going to say. To your point, one of the things that the Trump administration has done is it has told the Department of Justice to back off on the investigations into the federal civil rights investigations into police misconduct. And so there are, for instance, Newark, New Jersey right now is operating under a federal consent decree. But the Trump administration has sort of said, like, we don't want to continue monitoring, and we are pulling back on all of those kinds of consent decrees and those kinds of investigations. The Biden-Harris administration would get right back to it. And we see the impact of those federal consent decrees and the federal government engaging in monitoring. It's really been helpful. It helps communities on the ground stay accountable, address the problems that are identified. And we're seeing, again, the Trump administration completely pulled out of those types of investigations. Biden and Harris would go back in.
And they are a true education.
Can I just elaborate? To a consent decree then is a decree that basically holds a municipality or a local government to a higher standard of reducing racial disparity in its arrest. Is that it?
Well, so in Newark, for instance, the Newark police were—
For those of us who are not immersed in the law.
Thank you so much. So the Newark police were sued because they were using stop and frisk policies in ways that disparately targeted Black young men in particular, but poor people and Black people in particular in Newark. And through the course of the federal investigation that came out of that lawsuit, sure enough, there were these really significant patterns of racial disparities. And so to end the lawsuit, the city of Newark entered into a consent decree where they agreed to implement certain changes that were designed to reduce the way that they were using stop and frisk against poor people of color. And the federal monitors, literally, they're in Newark. They every month, every 3 months, they have a meeting and they look at data and they analyze things and they set targets and they write reports and they keep the Newark Police Department responsive to what they're supposed to be doing. Under the Trump administration, those kinds of consent decrees are not happening.
Yes, yeah. And in fact, I've actually been following the Newark consent decree. It's part of one of my many research projects going on. And we have one of the monitors coming on one will be on our webinar next week, actually, Andrea McChristian. And so absolutely correct.
Do you want to advertise your webinar in case you want to attract some of our alums who might? Oh,
yes, I certainly should. So
I just realized we're taping this. What is the date of your webinar?
Yes, I certainly should. So we are having a webinar sponsored by the college, right, as well as the Justice Studies Department on October 22nd, 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. You can certainly feel free to contact either of us on the screen and we can send you the flyer. There is a link that you'll have to go to reserve, but basically it's Race and Justice in America, unpacking police violence, mass incarceration in the courts. So basically going more in depth on a lot of the issues we're talking about now.
The good news is if you happen to be viewing this after the event is available for streaming and viewing afterwards.
Perfect.
That's right.
Thank you. So I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Jason. You were talking about.
Oh yeah. No, just basically, agreeing with Jessica as to the vast array, right, of patterns and practices that were found in Newark, but sort of going back to some of the Biden-Harris's campaign promises as well. I'm thinking about the intersectional, right, findings that came out of the DOJ report, insofar that they also found that the LGBTQ community was severely affected, particularly trans-identified individuals. And I know, again, in the current campaign cycle right now, Biden-Harris at least is paying attention to the importance of instituting programs that are conscious, right? That are conscious to equally other situated persons as they cycle through the criminal justice system.
Well, listening to you, it makes me very hopeful of the possibility of change if there's a change in the national government. Is you look at it and you say, are we two nations that are so polarized and so divided between, certain states are one way and other states are another, and then within certain states, more urban versus more rural settings. But it sounds as if even if the impetus is not coming from the ground, when there's that pressure from above, you can actually induce change even when the attitudes aren't necessarily supportive in the first instance.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do think it matters. I do think it matters. I think, though, it can't just be from the top down. It's got to be from the top down and from the bottom up. And hopefully then we meet in the middle, right? Because the system is so complex and is so large and operates on so many different levels. That with the federal government that's supportive of change, that's really helpful because it can provide funding and vision and leadership. And then at the bottom, you need the folks who are really willing to do the work, who are willing to take on the question of cash bail or marijuana prosecution or even other low-level nonviolent offense. We could actually just eliminate whole categories of low-level offenses and not call them crimes at all, or certainly not call them, crimes for which jail time is warranted. Like trespass, we could actually just call it trespass and give you a ticket.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That would be a really different vision. That has to happen at the local level. So there are, I think, ways in which they both work together.
Mm-hmm. And when you have a supportive Fed government in particular, right? And I'm thinking really within both the executive and the legislative branches, then you have really good courts, because I'm thinking of the consequence of the past election and having watched the last, judicial hearings, and I'm just, scratching my head like, oh my goodness, right? So I think, Jessica, that was a majorly good point.
Yeah, and Jason, you're 100% right. I mean, who we elect also winds up affecting who sits on the bench. And that matters tremendously because that creates the judicial landscape in which laws operate.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, maybe as a way of wrapping up, I can ask you both two questions, your thoughts. One, if you have a final message that you want our wonderful alumni and you want people out there to think about in terms of criminal justice and police reform, what would it be? And the second is, are you feeling hopeful that we are in a time of real change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Two giant questions for you.
I would just say in this season, I hope that people are voting with empathy, right? Voting within this ability to put yourselves in other people's shoes, even if you don't quite understand it, right? For instance, I know the slogan, defund the police, defund the police. Even if you don't quite understand it, but that you're at least trying to sort of understand, well, why is it that, these other populations, these other communities are more affected by said issues than I am, right? That you're at least trying to engage in dialogue to broaden your understandings around these issues. And that, again, you take that with you as you go to vote. These are dire times, and it's very important, very, very important that we try to get as much information as possible, right? And that we use that to then go and vote. I am hopeful. I think that the events from the summer all the way up until today has given me much hope to believe that come November, we might be embarking on a totally new horizon. So I am very hopeful. I want to be very optimistic in this moment.
Great.
So in terms of criminal justice reform and in terms of policing, which I think was your specific question, I think there has been a recognition of something that's been happening for a very long time. And what we need to do is a reset. And it doesn't mean that the police are bad. And it doesn't mean that we have to throw away public safety as a goal. We all want to live in communities that are safe and that are healthy. But we also have to recognize that something has gone wrong. And we need to start thinking about better ways to utilize a police force while also investing in communities, getting at root causes of crime, and holding police officers accountable, right? That's part of what we didn't really get to, but holding police officers accountable so that we all understand like what's happening and what's not okay to be happening on the streets. So that's part of a dialogue, and I think we all would like to know how to stop police violence. When we see things like George Floyd, everybody's jaw is on the floor. We're all recoiling in horror. What are the steps that can occur in society, in our policing practices that can make a difference? And there are steps to be taken. And so that would be sort of my vision as well. And I agree with Jason. There are things that need to happen, and they can happen. And then in terms of, am I hopeful? It's really interesting. I had a wonderful opportunity just the other day to moderate a panel down in Texas. And how I wound up being the moderator at this panel in Texas, I'm still not entirely clear, but I had the privilege of talking with a Texas House representative and the head DA of this county where San Antonio is and the head public defender. And to hear them talking in the deep part of Texas about all the different criminal justice reform policies they were taking on the ground did leave me incredibly hopeful. Because if I can have that conversation in Texas, well, gosh, that means there really is an opportunity for change across this country. And that's exciting. That's really exciting. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful. My fingers are crossed for outcomes that will promote criminal justice reform. And I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in the next few weeks.
Well, let me wrap this up then by just saying I love both of your final comments, because for me they captured some of what I think is so special about humanities and social sciences that I hope our alums will remember and think about how valuable humanities and social sciences education is. And one is because we want to encourage people. We want to embrace a society that feels hopeful about positive change, about the possibility of living in a truly just, democratic society that's truly inclusive and truly plural. Some of the things that you've talked about, to me, the idea of learning how to look at each other and listen to each other with empathy, and try and broaden your understanding. And I think some of the things that you were saying for me also evoke the idea of being able to learn how to evaluate statements and asking, are they valid, are they not valid? But underneath it all as well, there was a lot of discussion about the importance of innovation, of finding creative new ways to solve problems. And this idea that people are recognizing that the criminal justice system and the policing system, even if you're not a progressive, that it's actually really harming the nature of society and government because of its cost. So there's actually even the possibility of forming coalitions with people who might not be progressive, but who actually want to make sure that their children are getting a proper education in public school because they can't afford it. These are all sorts of things that I think humanities and social science training helps us to think about. And I am so grateful. I learned so much listening to the two of you, and I hope everyone else did too. Thank you, and stay safe, stay well.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Peter. Thanks to the Montclair State community for having us.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So I think I just click end. All right. Take care, folks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.